I would like to welcome one and all on today's special session. We are delighted to have a person of the stature of Dr. Arpita Mukherjee with us. So, students, this session is for you, and Dr. Mukherjee will be speaking with you. And post her session, if you have any question and answers, we shall have a separate session on that. So, before I start, let me give a brief introduction of Dr. Mukherjee. Dr. Arpita Mukherjee is a professor at ICRIER, which stands for Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. It's an economic policy think tank based in the national capital. She has over 25 years of experience in policy oriented research, working closely with the government in India and policymakers in the European Commission and its member states, United States, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and in East Asian countries. She has conducted studies for several international organizations, Indian industry associations, non-governmental organizations, and companies. Her research areas include trade and investment, services, WTO, bilateral and regional trade agreements, e-commerce, special economic zones, economic corridors, food supply chain, startups and entrepreneurs, retail, ICT, food processing, and other sector studies, and labor mobility. She specializes in sector and product specific market trends, go to market strategy, and government policies. Dr. Mukherjee has a PhD in economics from the University of Portsmouth, UK, and prior to joining ICRIER, she worked with the UK based think tank Policy Studies Institute and taught at the University of Portsmouth. She has over 80 publications, including national and international referred journals, books, and books chapters and government reports. Dr. Mukherjee is a member of various government committees and policy panels and is in the editorial board of several journals. She has been external reviewer to theses of IIFT, JNU, and IIM Bangalore, and has presented her work in different international events. She is a regular contributor to newspapers and magazines. So once again, I welcome Dr. Mukherjee. Thank you so much for sparing your valuable time from your busy schedule. Now, as you know, we have recently opened this School of Public Policy and International Affairs, and we wish our students to have exposure not just to classroom learning, but the real world. And that will happen when people like you who are in the thick and thin of policy making speak with them about the issues, challenges, and the opportunities. So, in that context, this is a very well deserved session, if I may say. Okay, so you will be speaking on the role of economics in public policy, and we all know how important economics is and how it influences public policy. So I hand over the session to you, Dr. Mukherjee. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghuraj, for the kind introduction, and to Devanshu for inviting me to speak. This is indeed a topic very close to our heart because so many economic indicators actually drive policies, and economists do play a role in in the policymakers thought process. And you see a lot of lawyers, economists among the policymakers of any country. Just to move to the next slide, how I tried to design my presentation was that I try to focus on what is all about public policy, then look into how economics can have different tools and angles to look into public policy, what happens when they align, what happens when they don't align, both in the context of different layers of policy. Now, public policy is a very wide term because governments can be at the you can have different governance structure. You can have a very centralized structure, you can have a quasi federal structure, you can have a very fragmented structure, like where you have a governance required at the village or a panchayat level. So your governance can be across multi layers, and every country has to look into certain level of provincial management or certain level of governance at a disaggregated level. Now, then we look into some of the factors that a public policy are influenced with. I know if we can move to that slide on the diagram slide. So there are some intangible factors and there are tangible factors. Tangible factors is, the country size, its population. So you have certain things which are given by a country, the size, the population, its natural resources, its agriculture versus industrial endowments, and certain kind of military and strategic powers. And then you also have a governance structure. So the policies are dependent upon the government structure, the political structure, the institutional structure. When you do policies, you look into many other areas which are, how are your endowments that can be enriched. For example, if you're looking into India, you would look into huge amount of population, the young population. So you're trying to enrich it by education, technical skilling. People are into services sector, how you enrich them. And then you go back to, and then you have the ideology. Governments have certain ideology. So if your ideology is that, we have to promote Swadeshi, so that will influence your policy making. How you want to be in international sphere, how active you want to be. You want to be docile, you want to be a major player in the global supply chains, you want to be a very strategic player. That will influence your policy. And of course, among all of these, there are personal views of the policymaker. So personal views of the policymaker, their decision they take actually influence a lot. Let us go back, Anu, to the previous slide. So what happens is that you take any simple decision, that any decision can have somebody talking in favor of a decision or against a decision. So when India got independence, we took a decision that we will not allow foreign investment. We will grow our domestic capabilities. We will become self-reliant. We will promote public sector enterprises. So that was a decision that was taken. Over the years, what happens is that this decision may undergo changes. So over the years, what happened is public sector also led to public sector reduced, monopolies reduced, inefficiencies, the funding was not enough for government to support the loss-making enterprises. And in the 80s, we started thinking about liberalization. This liberalization took a full-blown turn by an external factor, which is a IMF loan conditionality. So when IMF came, they said that, look, nothing doing, you have to do a big bang reform, right? So we were thinking about reforms in the 1980s, but we had to go a big bang way because it was guided by not by us, by an international organization that took us to take certain public policy initiatives. Now, what could we do at that point? Because if you are looking into the Indian Constitution, you will see that Indian Constitution has certain items in the union list, certain items in the state list, certain items in the concurrent list. Now, if you look at IMF, when they pushed a reform, what happened in other countries were, like for example, compare us with any of the ASEAN countries which also went for an IMF reform. They actually, IMF told them to open up the entire value chain, open up retail, open up the supply chains. So that is how they were moving the manufacturing to the retailing to the supply chain. However, in India, agriculture was a state subject. Much of the issues were under the state, labor and manufacturing opening was much more complicated. What part of manufacturing could be opened was what was in the hand of the central government. So the central government removed the licensing Raj, reduced the tariff, removed the quota. So they started working on materials which were in their hand, leaving the other materials like labor reforms or agricultural reforms, which they call the second generation reform, which you will still see in 2020. We are struggling with Agricultural Act and Labor Act. So that is something they left for the future to decide. So what we are seeing is that we look at policies, we leave certain policies aside, we actually redo our policies. But in the thick of the reforms in 1997, before 1997, there were no restrictions on FDI in retail. And in 1997, in the thick of the liberalization during the Congress Manmohan Singh ji government, the FDI retail restriction was imposed mostly to lure the retail class, the unorganized retail class, which was the vote bank of the BJP. So look how politics and economics and logics are here. The economics aside, IMF conditionality aside, the logic was more political to actually go in for a policy to ban FDI in retail. So because at that time when the economy was opening up, a number of manufacturers, global manufacturers were looking into India, and so were a number of retailers. So that was a time when there was a fear that, you know, Indian retail market may be swamped by the big retailers of the world. So let's move into the next slide, please. Next. So basically, what do you do when you use economics in policy making? You use economics to give a rationality to your policy. So I can have a policy which I want to see how the policy is going to be accepted. Then I apply economics, or I see the data, how things are doing. Then I apply economics, or I want to make a rational choice. So do I allow FDI? Do I not allow FDI? If I allow FDI, what happens to the smaller players? What kind of support? Should I give a positive incentive, or should I do a negative incentive on FDI? So these are the kind of policy decisions that government needs to take. Now, whenever there is a big project, the government may invest in a big project, and the government may be questioned. Later, a CAG may question, anybody else may question, why are you doing this project? What has been the implication? Where has the money gone? So government needs to do all their evaluations, strategies, options in place. Now, some of these for some of these areas, government may completely be confused, because what happens is that, you know, there may be multiple very good quality economists who will be arguing to and for a topic. In a more COVID-like situation, I was thinking of a topic like fiscal stimulus. Will fiscal stimulus enable a country like India to come out of growth? So there are economists like Paul Krugman, Stiglitz, who has said that, you know, you need to actually boost demand. And many of us do believe that, you know, Indian slowdown is because there is no demand and there is need to generate demand. And you will see a view within the government also. They are thinking about how to generate demand. So they are coming out with policies. Okay, you can convert your LTA into shopping and so on and so forth. They are thinking about various ways how you actually put money, a bit of money in the hand of the people, especially during this fiscal, the festival seasons, or that now that we are entering into Diwali and all the festivals, and how to boost up demand and how to boost up manufacturing through demand. Countering this, there will be other views, and there are a lot of economists are of the view that fiscal deficit is not good for any country. You know, you should not go make a very high fiscal deficit. So economist, while it is very suited for understanding it and it is data driven, the economists are not uniform in their view. And their views may change because they have to monitor a situation real time. And when you were in January or February, you never realized that no economist actually predicted that India will have such a big, you know, shortfall in the growth rate. So certain unprecedented events may also happen in your economy, which is beyond your control. So you always have to do a real time policy making. But why the policymakers still rely on economists is because the next slide is that they will always find some economist. Anu, the next slide, please. They will always find some economist who will be able to justify their doings. You know, so basically you are justifying the doings, and you can actually provide a good justification. So there are certain good frameworks that have developed, and I was giving, while I was reading this, I was looking into the framework of inclusive growth. Now UN has talked about inclusive growth by 2030, given all these SDG goals and targets and whatever countries, some have set targets, some have allocated funds, some are monitoring. Many countries like India do always take out policies or may have say that, you know, the objective are like this, but they don't give specificities that this much of fund will be allocated, this is the target, this is how I will monitor. Whereas there are other countries who will say, this is the fund which is allocated, this is what I want to monitor, what I want to achieve. Now, when you try to do this, you can always rework on your targets, and sometimes you rework on your targets. Economics and policymakers work closely to rework on their targets to reach a goal that is acceptable to everybody. For example, when I was working on the issue of FDI in retail, you know, at that point in time, the issue of when we were working on the issue of FDI in retail, and that was the time when foreign retailers were coming in, but yet the big Indian retailers, for example, the Tata, only a few had just ventured into retail. They were announcing, like Tata, Reliance, they were starting their retail. So at that time, the Indian retailers told the Indian government that, you know, if we can go slow on the FDI drive, that kind of helps us to, you know, get a foothold on our sectors and grow. India at that time did have certain brands, you know, the Indian corporates were also creating brands. So India came out with the concept of a brand-based retail. Brand-based retail, actually, it is very meaningless. I mean, if you look into the global context, no country has a brand-based retail. But when you, so basically Adidas and Reebok will have the same brand owner. But what happened in this brand-based retail policy was that you are actually restricting the entry of multi-brand retailers like Walmarts of the world, and you are making it complex for the others who have owned many brands to enter. So it was so complex that, you know, you Marks and Spencer first entered into the clothing segment. It never after that entered into the food and grocery till date. So you so brands will have their sub brands. You go to any brand store, it has a sub brand. So there is, so IKEA, it took so long for IKEA to do it. So then the policymakers have known from the economics that this is how the entry strategies and plans work, create their own models based on which, you know, industry starts then adjusting. So how do the industry adjust? The industry will say, okay, if you remove the sourcing clause, I'm going to come in. So the industry then starts negotiating on the policies. So then the industry lobbying happens on a policy like retail, and when the policies are a bit complicated, the lobbyings will be much more, and that is the time when economists don't have any role to play. They have to take a back seat, because suppose if it is an unorganized retailer which is going to die, it can die any which way, by a big Indian farm or by a foreign farm, and to the one who is dying, it does not matter who kills it. So then the economic logic takes a back seat, and then the political logic and other logics come in. So economist, I would say, is one component of the whole complexities of the policy making. Now, how does economics play a picture? So, Anu, can we go to the next slide? I will first give you some examples of how the policies work. Then I will move into, you know, examples of what kind of economic tools can be used. Now, first, let us look into something like, you know, when UK government, many countries like UK and Australia, if Australia goes in for a trade agreement, Australia, you know, puts an open query questions to the industry that, you know, I want to do a trade agreement with this country, India, do tell me what problems you have. US government, through its United States restrictive barrier report, collects the material from the industry, publishes the material, you know, it after it collects, it cleans it up and publishes the material like, look, this country has this barrier. So there is an economic logic or a survey logic behind the data collection collection, data analysis. Based on the data analysis, certain plans and programs are designed and certain interventions are designed. In the case of international trade, for example, USTR documents are used by the US to talk. When they talk with the Indian policymakers, they will use those documents as backgrounders. For other times, government use these survey data and other data to have targeted policies or policy intervention. So if I know in this area there is a scope of dengue at this point in time, I need to take this decision. So secondly, it is about tax administration. Many times administrations are done based on economic data collection. So if I look at how easy or difficult it is to file the tax, what is the thing, what is the complexities, whether I'm filing the taxes, am I in a certain group, I have, I am probably evading taxes. Now, how do you do my behavioral analysis? Like, am I a genuinely good importer? So you look at my GST data, my import data, my tax data, and you build up a importer history to understand whether I'm good or not. So if I'm a good, you will maybe probably do a less rigid check on me. But if all these data are not matching, then you would also do a better, more rigid check on me. So these are the kind of tools that are used by a number of countries. Then they do complex economic analysis. Now, taxing alcohol is actually a very interesting example of complex economic analysis, because if you look into any of Indian states' budget, alcohol accounts for the top 3 of the state revenue, because it will be petroleum and alcohol. Other things have gone to GST now. Now, within the alcohol, there are different objectives of the state to give tax it. So Bihar said that I don't even want alcohol consumption. I don't really care about the tax. So it has a vision, like I will not allow it. So it is a sin good. So then there are states who will say that, okay, I am taxing this because it is a sin good. Then then what happens? Suppose if I tax it because it is a sin good, it can lead to actually consumption of the lower quality product. So I can go in for a branded alcohol to a huj. Now, sometimes the tax are used for other some purposes which is completely delinked with the tax. For example, during the Delhi COVID-19 pandemic, so many people went to get alcoholic beverages. When the market opened up, they put a 70% tax just to control the crowd. So there are many interesting policy tools that they administered. But UK is a very good example, because UK and Scotland, what they did is that they wanted to convert the people drinking habit into less but high quality drinks. So they did opposite taxes. They actually, Scotland calculated the production, consumption, taxation data, and they created a model, very complex economic model, based on which they were taxing less at the high-end brands and taxing more at the low-end brand, converting the product into something called a premiumization of the product. And therefore, they were doing the taxation. The other example is in case of India, every ministry, every government goes and comes out with a scheme. So finally, India has several schemes. Many of them we don't even use. We don't even know of, So Niti Aayog was trying to do some scheme evaluation last year. And what they were doing is they were actually trying to do a survey and do an economic analysis of the survey and the data to see that whether people know of the scheme, using the scheme, have benefited from the scheme, whether the state was taking money under the scheme, were utilizing the scheme. So now different states have different requirement. So there will be state, if you're talking about how to promote fishery, there will be state like Assam, which is completely landlocked and will be solely dependent on sweetwater fish. There will be state like Kerala. So the government has to then do complex econometric modeling and analysis and identify the needs and requirements of these various states, and then design the policy. Because when the government comes out with a policy, it has to be a policy that all states somewhere or the other should be able to benefit from the policy, and the poorer the state, logically speaking, they should get better benefit. But that's how a country should look into the activity. Next slide, please. Now, many countries now use data for very interesting output design. For example, in US, there was a significant amount of people who were committing crimes, and the US were not able to really handle the prison. You catch a person on the crime, you send him back to the prison, he comes back, he again does a crime, he goes back. So then they actually use the prisoner data, their mind, what they want to do, why they do the offense, and had a very focused strategy and provided a real-time support which reduced the, but so they were targeting that people should not go back to prison, because the people somehow got it like, okay, I'll do a crime, I'll go back, and then I'll come back again, do a crime, I'll go back. It's not like it was quite a happy-go-lucky life for them. So that life had to be taken care of. Similarly, in South Korea, actually many other countries today are doing this. They use a lot of data. You know, a custom authority, it is not viable for a custom to open a package. So then the custom went in for a selective survey. And in India also we do a selective survey. So I will open 5% of the container or something like that. But nowadays customs in countries like Australia, Korea, they have come out with rigorous economic modeling. So what they do, suppose if they are importing food, they would look at the country risk indicator. So if it is peanuts and if it is aflatoxin contamination, India will come high in the country risk index. So they look at country risk, they look at importer risk, they look at the product risk, and all of this risk, they'll give them a sampling format. So if you see, modern custom officers in some of the developed countries, they go there just with an iPad. They type the product code tells them whatever sample they need to do. So there is a personal, personal judgment. Along with that, the issue of corruption, bribes, everything dies down because he is following a process. Is it like this? Tick. Then the next process comes out. So the processes have been laid down by data analysis, and the data analysis has given rise to certain policies. Policies have been transferred into certain outcomes, and outcomes are and processes which are being followed by customs at the field. So this is how the policy happens. Next slide, please. Now, so we talked a lot about how it happens. Now what are the tools that lead to happen? In economics, we study a lot about macroeconomics and microeconomics. Macro looks at the overall economic strength with the key indicators: GDP, population growth, their income levels, GDP per capita, consumptions. Some countries, India does not collect, but some countries can regularly collect certain consumption data. We also look into labor force data, household survey data. So along with the census, the government does a lot of its own surveys to collect a lot of data, which are then analyzed to provide certain outcomes. Many countries, government in partnerships with multiple organizations collect data. Some of the countries, government do use the third-party data. So Euromonitor data is used by many countries. Kantar data for consumption is being used. So there are third-party. Nielsen data has been used for retail. Many countries, you will say, look at their Nielsen data to look at the retail growth. So they use both their own data collection techniques and the private sectors who have proven competence in certain areas of data collection to use those data together to design policies. Now, when you look at micro level policy, what benefit should I give to the apparel sector? That is where you have to do an industry specific study. What should I do in my Northeast? Again, you have to do a region specific study. So here, when a government comes out with a need, the need can be as micro level as you have to look into a village need, or a funding for a panchayat or a district. So those needs, both micro and macro tools, are used for such studies. Now, Now the tools that have been, next slide please, the tools that have been used for these studies have changed over the years. You know, previously the data collection process was manual, analysis process was using, you know, you use descriptive statistics or you used SPSS and other packages. Nowadays you mostly use Python kind of packages. The data collection has become online, so many of your descriptive graphs and tables are just click of a button. Then you are actually using technology. Like, you know, technology has its different levels of benefits. Like, you can now scan a lot of, you have a lot of observation. Now AI machine learning is moving away from a structured based questionnaires to more open-ended questionnaires. They're still struggling to actually capture case studies and open-ended questionnaires, but the technology in itself is evolving to make the data analysis faster and real time. And real time is very important because suppose a contaminated product enters a country through a port. India has around over 200 ports of entry for food products. So suppose if a product enters the country through a port, you immediately have to tell customs in all these that you stop. And that information has to go real time online into their system. So these are very, very important that you give a real-time alert. And often the alerts in such cases are given before they are analyzed. For example, if you want to see the alerts and how they can be economically analyzed, you can play around with the European Union RASFF portal and the Eurofight portal. It gives a lot of data of the project alert and rejections. And you know, you can do by country analysis, by product analysis, where our products stand, what is the reason for the rejection. So, you know, so then they provide a lot of data to justify their alerts, because otherwise as an importer I can question that you have allowed somebody else and not me. So the government also needs to build in its justification and its validity for its action using economic data. Now the more important part of the data is that data collection process is expensive. Primary data collection process is expensive. So while many of the developed countries do surveys based on random sampling, stratified sampling techniques, countries like India often do focus group discussions or case studies or stakeholders mapping and consultations to get the end results. But always a detailing out survey or a random sample always give a better result than, you know, along with the stakeholders consultation. Stakeholders consultation in itself, unless very carefully designed, can have biases. Maybe move into the next slide, please. So as you look into these areas, what I have already given you the example of the retail policy, which was designed for certain political objectives or strategic objective in mind. Again, a policy which is not evidence based is the FDI in e-commerce. India needs investment in logistics. Okay, when Walmart etc. came in, there was a condition that multi-brand retailer have to invest in the back end. So when the e-commerce came in, they said no back-end investment. So this is kind of a policy which is devoid of its, devoid of its own analysis. That, you know, if a person has to offer a service, if somebody is making me a commitment that, you know, my parcel will be delivered in 2 days or 3 days or 7 days, which any e-commerce company will give me a commitment, it cannot be that it does not have a control over a back-end. So logically, the policy defies all kinds of logic. So therefore, so then the policy becomes complicated. So, but there were certain lobbying going on. So there were some people who preferred to have this kind of policies. Now let us go into the outcome of the policy. The outcome of the policy was that when Flipkart and Walmart merged, it became all the more complicated, because one was told that you have to invest in the back end, the other was told you cannot invest in the back end, and therefore the government need to revise the policy again. So the policy in itself became null and void because it was not evidence based. So the government had to revise the policy. And when the government revised the policy, then comes the international lobbying. Then by that time US was very angry. So they stopped our GST. So, you were attacking it from the retail end, they attacked it from our export end. So we lost our GSP. So all of that complications were not thought about. That, if I do this, how am I going to be impacted? So, some people so somebody who had nothing to do with retail got impacted. So this is the complexity when you don't do the policy which is based on evidence and economics. Sin tax, I have already told you that, higher tax may not reduce consumption. Demonetization, another interesting thing in demonetization is that it may be done with many nice things and good things, and you will have economists arguing equally well for the benefit of demonetization and against the demonetization. But the success of the policy will be rated by whether the whole channels have been digitalized. Now, if I go back to a cash-based channel, then it is bad. But if it is digitalized, so probably the more recent COVID had a lot more digitalization impacts, right? But still, am I as an SME able to access a digital bank, totally do my banking, access loan, etc. digitally? Is the question that we need to understand. Can the benefits be digitally into an SME account? In India, it was not possible because we did not know the number of SMEs. We knew the number of farmers. We had a farmer account. We have crop insurance. Hence, the first set of incentives actually went to the farmers because we had a clear picture on who the farmers were. From a policy perspective, from an economic data collection perspective. However, we still today don't have a clear picture who our SMEs are. We do not have a database. We do not have a database of migrants, and these were the sectors which were being affected, and these have come out when these have been the problems, and we need to design. We don't have packages for them, and these have been come out with, in the RBI and other reports. They have come out with these issues at the highest level. There is a recognition that needs to be looked into. Compare us with a country like New Zealand. New Zealand was able to identify the number of SMEs. For schemes, it is very important to identify, because if you don't know whom you are subsidizing, you don't know how much is your amount of money that you have to dedicate for this purpose. So, in New Zealand, they knew exactly whom they want to subsidize. The money went to the bank of the people. So these SMEs were digitally connected as a part of a financial compensation package. So this is where there was an issue in India. So these are the kind of things that we learn, and these are very interesting learning for us, because it enables the banks also to think, yes, there is a gap in our design of packages for the SMEs probably. Next slide. So as we were discussing all of this, every country wants to be domestically self-reliant, and this self-reliance and development of your value chain has also been today, because there are threats from some countries like China. There are strategic threats, there are economic threats, there are threats of loss of value chains. So over the few years, ever since the previous election in the US, there has been a drive towards, protectionism. When the bigger players who are more open economies globally decide that they want protectionism because they may be losing both their economic and strategic and business control, smaller players also like to adopt it. And we also as a country at different stages try to adopt protectionism. So then what happens? Every country wants to promote export. Every country wants to be protectionist. So there is a domestic policy versus international trade policy debate, where we want to export, but we don't want to import. So that has been a real big issue in many countries. The other issue that are interesting for us to look into is the policy of Make in India versus Startup India. If you look into many countries like European countries, Australia, several countries in the world, Chile, and many Asian countries, they have come out with a startup visa. They have come out with a startup policy where they allow startup partnerships between the foreign startups, local startups, because they are trying to help. What is a startup? Smaller farms with innovative technologies which have a capability to scale up. So they are trying to help a certain types of firm to grow, scale up, create jobs, have patents, move up the technology ladder. Now, in case of India, the Startup India policy is only for domestic startup, and among the so many domestic startups, hardly 150 have availed any benefit under it. So there is a gap between Make in India and Startup India, because Make in India is actually, it doesn't give any incentives. It gives a vision. It is like a campaign. And Startup India gives an incentive, but it is not fitting into the vision, because we are not talking about what to do if you are a foreign startup who enters into partnership with Indian startup, or who wants to invest in India. So therefore, there is a lack of consistency between these two policies, which can be analyzed using economic tools about their successes, about their impacts on manufacturing, whether really it has resulted in the job. You can look at the share of manufacturing in the GDP data, manufacturing growth, new firms and investment coming in. All these data will show a success of a policy. Now, again, the domestic policy, many countries' domestic policy is to protect the domestic industry, whereas we take a WTO commitment where we say that two types of subsidies are prohibited. One is export link subsidy, and second is favoring the domestic over imported product. That doesn't mean you don't give subsidy. You can give subsidy. But export link subsidies, if they are prohibited, we still give it. For example, India still gave export-linked subsidies under the FTP. Even during the COVID, we increased MEIS, the scheme, by 1 year. However, in 2019 only, US challenged it and we lost the case in the WTO. So what happens? If I continue to give you a subsidy, which is challenged and we have lost the case, as an exporter, you will face a countervailing duty. So for you, it does not matter. You may take the subsidy and export, and then your real benefits are much less. So therefore, what you could have done is giving some kind of a smart WTO smart subsidies to targeted databases on areas where it cannot be challenged. For example, I can give an exporter subsidy on logistics, because logistics is a services and there is no service discipline in the WTO. So what am I now doing? I am doing an international policy. I'm bringing in an international or a trade policy. Along with that, I'm bringing in some data of the exporters. I'm trying to estimate their logistic cost. Accordingly, I'm trying to design my subsidy. So I'm trying to find the export value chain, the costs that are incurred in the value chain, which part of this value chain can be subsidized within what is allowed under the agreement. So now, if you don't do that, then there are a couple of issues. Sometimes you may actually do whatever you want and get along very well. And good example of this is that India signed the ITA 1 for zero tariff, but we actually we increased tariff on smartphones, right? And we said that smartphones were not there in 1997, so it is a new product. Now you can go and argue this in the WTO that smartphone is a mobile phone or not a mobile phone, and continue to give your subsidies. And it worked for India. I mean, this is a smartly designed policy which worked for India. In spite of taking a commitment, we increased the subsidies. Okay. But at the end of the day, what happens is it makes us very difficult to sign trade agreements. Because suppose the trade agreements talks about lowering tariff. Now, if you keep on increasing tariff, you spend a lot of your time and effort negotiating tariffs in trade agreement. And that is not where you should put in your effort, because everybody else has zero tariff. So they sit to negotiate other kinds of issues, like, they put in regulatory barriers, they put in standard related barriers, where we are not able to spend our negotiating efforts. because the moment we are always defensive, they will tell us you have high tariff, lower tariff. So there is no point in increasing the tariff first and then starting and lowering it to each country that we entered trade agreement with. So we need to really think about what should be our trade policy and where the policy should be with minimum cost to the businesses. Like if I go and sign a trade agreement with 7 ASEAN countries with 7 different tariffs, will the businesses be interested to use the FTAs? Many a times our FTAs are not utilized because it is too complex for the businesses to use. So we also have to understand that, you know, the logic which the business understand. We can, so therefore that is very important when you think about the benefits. Secondly is about the value chain. Somebody's final product can be somebody's input. So, you know, a machinery, agricultural machinery, a company in agricultural machinery will like it to be manufactured in India and high import duties. Whereas a company which is actually using agriculture machinery, or a farmer using it, would like a lower duty. So there is always an industry lobbying that happens where, you know, some industry can go and increase their tariff. But in that whole process, what happens is sometimes we are doing something which is known as imposing countervailing duties. So we are putting duties on the raw material which is higher than the duty on the final product. Therefore, you know, policies have to therefore look into a cost and benefit analysis of the policy much more deeply before it is implemented, even a simple policy like a tariff policy, because it can have a long impact on your supply chain. And many a times the supply chain don't happen because you are putting a lot of barriers. In case of India, the agricultural manufacturing don't happen in India because the manufacturer will need a local input and a foreign input. So it may need a Thai lemon along with the Darjeeling tea to manufacture a lemon tea. Now, if you impose a restriction on inflow of the Thai lemon, then, you know, then the manufacturing cannot happen in India. So those are the kind of things that we need to talk about, and therefore the policy makers need to engage very widely with the economist, and therefore they have to design policies carefully planned based on their economic logic. Thank you. I think we are over now. Thank you for, so this is something that I wanted to really talk about, and I'm happy to take some questions and talk about this more. This is the broader framework in which I wanted the discussions to flow.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mukherjee. The session was very informative, and I'm sure our students must have learned a lot, particularly about the economic influence on public policy and the impact therein. So students, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask Dr. Mukherjee. She will answer them.
Yeah, I can see Mayank there raising his hand. Mayank, you can go ahead, please. Mayank, before you ask the question, I would request if you can give your small introduction, just your name and the class. So that would also be a good thing for Mukherjee ma'am to understand, and then you can proceed with your question.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, to the management for organizing such kind of interactive platform so that we can have a good exposure and interaction with the respected members who are there in their respective fields. And my short brief introduction would be, ma'am, hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. We have got a lot many facts related to international economics and public policy. Myself, I am Mayank Rathore from the International Relation and Public Policy Institute. This is a school of that particular JLU University. And my question would be, ma'am, first of all, ma'am, what we consider economics? Economics is basically, it is a discipline where we deal with the using of certain kind of resources in order to fulfill the needs of the society. But the thing is, you are saying that we need to, policymakers have to engage with economics, right? Because the policymakers, basically the ultimate objective of policymakers is to design a certain kind of policy that will tend to solve the problems that are existing in the society, and the solution of those problems would be by using the economic resources. Now, my point is, when the foreign countries, we are outsourcing each and everything to the foreign countries, ranging from collection of data to the management of resources and each and everything. How can we make sure that foreign countries, the data, just now you said that it is all about data. The problem in India is basically collection of data. We don't have proper sampling of the data, we don't have collection of data. And other thing, now we have said that World Trade Organizations, they try to manipulate policies in such a way that the dominating countries in the Western nations, they create such policies that benefit those Western nations. So my first question, ma'am, is, in a situation where data is not in our control, in a situation where foreign countries, they dominate international institutions and they try to formulate policies that they benefit, in that situation, how can we rely that the data on which Indian government institutions are formulating policies, they would be fine at they would be finally benefiting the stakeholders that exist in our nation? Because data, we don't know, the thing that they say, that we don't believe that they are correct. So at one end, we don't have data, at an end the data that is being manipulated by them, and now we are using that same data to formulate policies. The first question, how we can ensure the authenticity of data while formulating public policies. Then the second question is, how we can change the scenarios so that we can use the indigenous data in a way that we would be with that data would be genuine, in a sense that we would be formulating policies that is exactly reflecting the needs of the society.
Thank you, Mayank. You have asked a very interesting question. May I request actually Anu to go to the first slide, please? The interesting question is, you are talking about the data and access to data. Okay, and this has been, not this slide, the cover, first slide, please. So the data, this is, see, basically, India is one of the largest generator of data, and logically speaking, online data. So Mayank, let me correct you here, because we have Aadhaar. We are linked with our Aadhaar logically. I mean, you can question the validity of the Aadhaar and non-validity of the Aadhaar. That is a different question. But most of the Indians today have Aadhaar, which is linked to their bank account. Bank account is, Aadhaar is also linked to your phone. Correct? And yet you are thinking you don't have your data and you don't have a health data. You know, think about India, you have the data. Where you really lack is you are not processing your data well. So, but Indians are the one who is processing global data. Who is doing the 90% of the work in Amazon in the US? It is Indians. So if Indians are processing global data, why will they not be able to process their own data? Indian government is the largest generator of data. Suppose if you are filling up a form in your custom where you are saying that whether you are importing it zero duty through an FTA route or through the normal route, is that data not being collected? That data is being collected. Why is that data not being shared for researchers to work on? How much data? So it is a matter of data collection. Then there is a matter of data cleaning, analysis, processing. Data by itself is useless until it is collected, processed, and analyzed properly. And what you can say is that India does not focus or spend on that activity. So that is a big issue, and that we also say in our my recent working paper talks about it. That I wrote for the government also. So for the government also we write that data is not a problem. In COVID-19 so much data is collected. Now the very important is to process that data. Collecting of the data, holding on to the data is not a problem. Now coming to the question is that Amazon has a large access to the data. How does Amazon has access to the data? Amazon has access to the data because we are an Amazon customer. If I am not an Amazon customer, it will not have access to my data. If I am an Apple 4 customer, it has access to my data. Now, which data among this is needed by the government? Does the data needed by the government is that either, you know, whether I'm wearing a red color kurti or a blue color kurti, or whether I like a black color kurti is needed by the government, or the government needs a specific data which is called data for governance. And that data for governance will be, suppose if there is a murder and the murderer is absconding and you need to access his Gmail account. That is called a data for governance. Or there is somebody who is doing something hate speech in a Facebook or a social media or something, you need to stop that. That is called data for governance. So it is very important to understand what is the data that you need and what personal data that you need. And finally, you will realize that you need very limited amount of personal data for your governance. What you need is a very generic country level, state level, district level data. So if you have to do the data, if you want to do your policy, you need very basic data like how much is the export of a state. We don't have that data in public domain. So that is the data that you need. Governance data are some, you have to first build your database which with the focus on important data, that is data for governance. Then you come out with the other data. And if we follow step by step about what data we need, how we need to govern that data, how we need to analyze and monitor that data. Therefore, I said that any equipment is useless until the economists come in there. Until they analyze the data by itself is completely useless. You can use your best technology to collect it. So those are the kind of things that you need to think about. And when you think about that, you will get it that, you know, there is a lot. The reason what India is asking private players to do is, you collect the data, you give me something which you can monetize. No company, whether it is Indian or foreign, is going to do that. Money, we can keep on asking for that. Nobody is going to do that. But we can tell them, you help me to monetize my data. So I have other data, you can sign a confidentiality clause for which a country like India, and for which the matter any country across the globe, requires a very rigid data protection and consumer privacy clause. And if you have one like the GDPR, which 1/3 of the companies in the world are adhering to, you have no worry. Your data is fairly protected and you develop upon that. You develop upon that and you think about other things on how to make your policies more rigid. But at the end of the day, you have to have your own data, collect it, use it, and frame policies based on your data. Yes, Mayank.
Ma'am, yes, you're very correct in a sense that we have numerous amount of data. The problem is to process it, and the problem is to use that data according to the need of the public policy. So how we would proceed in this field, because we know that yes, the problem is of processing the data. Now, what is the solution of it?
See, the Indian government need to actually do a lot, have to invest. Any government, any country government needs to invest a lot in research. And you know, when I was doing UK's tax administration, I found how beautifully they have designed a multidisciplinary research team, which includes statistician, public policy people, pure economists, the mainstream econometric modeling people, lawyers. We do not have that. We need that kind of strong teams to do economic research. And yes.
Ma'am, for research, you need scholars. For scholars, you need proper academicians who are very best in economic and economist related field. But the education sector, what we are facing, if we ask 10 students that who want to become an economist, 9 of them, they even don't know the importance of economics, first thing. So they don't try to pursue the career in economics. The second thing is, the literature or the content which is available in Indian academic field is very limited as far as as far as economics and related economics tools are concerned. So unless and until we don't have economics or economics related literature that is relevant to Indian economics or Indian economical field is concerned, because many of the times we rely on the economics and economic related theories that are given by foreign nations and other kind of.
Okay. Mayank, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Since we have limited time, so what I would suggest is you can just note down the question you have and probably you can mail it to ma'am and she will revert back. That way others will also get a chance. Fine. So if any other student has any question, please ask Dr. Mukherjee and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer that.
And before we come to that, Mayank, I would be loving to answer the question regarding the research thing. So I'll take it with after the session itself. And I've been receiving a question, so if I may please ask that. We do say that the unorganized sector plays a very important role in the economy of our country, but still the acceptance for the same is not there. Even the policies are not framed for the individual states. Ma'am, we would like to have your inputs on the same when it comes to the economic, like the division. I guess that was also covered with one of your major slides as well, that it's the problem of divergence, the problem of distribution, which is not equal, which should be equal rather. And I guess the demand and supply basically goes hand in hand together, not in isolations, that this sector needs, or there is, for industry, we are just targeting the top 3 industries. So it should be the unorganized and organized together. So your take on that now.
Unorganized formats in Indian industry operates at different levels. Okay, first the industry itself can be talked about as unorganized, like unorganized retail business. Now, why is it is very simpler to formalize certain sectors. Okay, for example, if you are in an unorganized manufacturing unit, if you are even given a GST number, if you are accessing a bank loan, if you are handholded to scale up, you tend to move towards an organized SME model. So that is very simple. Now, sometimes retail is by choice, and many a times retail is by lack of alternative occupation. That leads to unorganized. Sometimes the sector can be formal, but it still have unorganized employment. For example, construction sector. The company can be a totally formal and a large company, but it relies on, even automobile industry brands relies on contract labor, right? So that is a labor law issue. So there are issues that lead to an unorganized sector employment or an unorganized sector creation. Why unorganized sector is defined in various ways. It does not have a corporate governance. It may not have access to corporate ways of funding. And in my opinion, and in fact, we are really working on it, that SMEs should be allowed access to funding. And during the COVID-19, in fact, I was giving a lecture somewhere, and one SME told me that, ma'am, you get so many calls in the day for opening an account or to take an investment by the bank. Did you ever get a call to do a business? And I realized that we don't have a financial package for SME. So this is a very, very important point that we need to look into from a formalized point of view.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I guess that has brilliantly answered the question. So I'll now move to my question, which was there, and it is in relation to one of your papers which you have written. So it is titled as The Political Economy of Retail Liberalization, the Case of India. And on going through that particular paper, which was there, I came to understand that I'd like to compliment that it's very well articulated, one of the research papers for that particular thing. Although, yes, it is a 2014 paper, if I'm correctly remembering the date. I felt when we were reading that particular thing, it even goes today in the post-COVID world. And the points which are written out there can easily be incorporated at this particular time, where we are seeing a revival, basically. And after this short period of lockdown, which was an unprecedented time, which neither the economists nor the government even have thought so. So a small insight on that particular thing, that would be really great for the students. Although what I'll also do, I'll share that paper with your permission to our students as well, so that they can get an insight that how that economy side of a retail business is also working. So yes,
See, basically, when we were doing this work on FDI in retail, I'll give you my personal experience. First of all, when we were given this work, we were asked to do a survey and to find out how the retailers are being affected. And initially we did a kind of a, because it was, we were young, we did a kind of a random sampling survey, and we found that if a mall is coming up in your neighborhood, the impact, when you see a big retail out in your neighborhood, the impact is very different from if it is in a very structured, in a faraway area. Also, the liberalization drive in countries are very different, and we actually looked into the first book from which this paper is taken is on FDI and retail. It is a consumer affairs publication. In that we found that when Japan opened up first luxury retail, and then after the retail kind of settled down, it opened up food and grocery. The big bangness in which you open up is also very important, like whether I open up it whole country, try it out in some areas, like China tried it out in 8 zones. So all of that actually impacts your policy making. Where your policy fails is when you actually allow loopholes and backdoors. Loophole and backdoor is neither the foreign player is happy, nor the Indian player is able to get the full benefit out of it. See, and that is where I was, the political economy, when it happens, is exactly like Maya's point. Actually, I will go back to his point. That his point is that data is like oil, and everybody else is taking away our data, so we need to panic. Now, this is not based on an economic logic. This is based that somebody said it and everybody else is running after it. So, you also are a large generator of the data, and your data is with you. So you have to first look at how I capitalize on the data that is with me, rather than capitalizing on somebody else's profit. And once I look into it, there are other ways. Suppose if I think this guy is going to take away my market, and it can be a genuine fear that Walmart can take away my market, or the big retailers of the world will take away my market, you can actually have a very good anti-competitive practice in place. You can give positive intensive to the smaller retailers. You may actually do a zoning regulation to put a restriction. You may do a restriction, and you may monitor predatory pricing so that people don't sell below. But these are things that can be done. But that does not mean that you allow some tweeting and turning. In case of India, in the political economy of retail, sometimes IKEA is writing part of the policy, sometimes Tesco is writing part of the policy, Starbucks also wrote a little bit. So the policy becomes so complicated that nobody is satisfied, because each industry is trying to, at the time that it is entering, it is trying to model the policy to its own requirement. And that is something which can create such a big governance issue, because the government, like this Flipkart Walmart merger, is a governance issue, right? Because the government itself nobody can do such a big merger without the government knowing about it. And suddenly the government realized that, this is an issue. So if you make your policy complicated, it can have a repercussion, especially in a democratic setup. And that is not true for India. It can be true for any countries in the world. Like you see that when US came out with a policy about students, universities protested and they kind of won the protest, right? So you have also checks and balances within your economy. So you need to be very careful how these checks and balances are going to react to your policies.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Anyone else wants to ask a question to Dr. Mukherjee?
We can take one more question from Mayank. No issues.
So, first, let me answer Mayank's previous question. And Mayank, you are wrong there. I wonder if today I had to get admission in a DU college, where would I be? My marks would have not allowed me entry anywhere. So you are saying that there is no demand for economics. I see so much demand that, the colleges have the courage to, increase up. Economics have never been treated like a subject where nobody conceptualized at our times that, you need 97% to enter into a college with economics. So you are saying there is no demand. I see there is huge amount of demand and there is no supply. You need more colleges, more economics, more public schools. I can tell you for myself, we want people, we don't get people, we don't get good quality people. And there is a shortage because the skill is now used. But see, when you study economics, you are not coming to public policy alone. You are not coming to academics alone. And you are going in many places. You are even joining a lot of industries are into data analytics, right? So we get only a small component of those who want to come to research or things like that. I don't think that if your numbers are good and if you're doing well, job is an issue. Job market by itself is down, but don't consider that the job market is doing well and we are doing badly. Everything is doing badly. So keeping the job market aside, where you really need to focus on, Mayank, is you think about, and people like yourself should force the government to spend on research more, spend on academic quality. We do not give credentials. Look at if we are trying to compete with China, see how much China is spending on research. See how much patent do they have. So if you have to compete, you have to compete there. So see how much China government is investing in digitalization and data collection and data research. Then let us do that. If we have to follow their policy that my data is mine, I will not allow anybody, then we have to do everything like them, right? So that is you think about that. Now, I don't want to showcase any data is a different story. So I want to be all my data and nobody will access my data. That's a very, kind of models that some countries do follow. But if I cannot be halfway through, I can be either the US model or the European Union model or the Chinese model. I cannot be in between the two models.
I totally agree with you, ma'am. And I'd also like to add, Mayank, on this thing that it's not only the pure economists that they go for a research. So for example, if I can give my example, I did my PhD in law, specifically that was an intellectual property right issue, which also involved the economic side. So the multidisciplinarity, or I would rather suggest that economy is a such field which is required, whether it's public policy, whether it's law, whether it's your management side as well. So each of the big MNC have that sales department, marketing department, but they also have the managers or the economists sitting at their back who is formulating every such thing. So
for us also, as we are not into pure academics, right? I do not have a kind of a teaching that there is a book curriculum. I do agree with Mayank on some cases that curriculums need to be revised. And I think now many colleges, I would say over the last 10 years, I have seen that many colleges are trying to bring in experts from the businesses, and along with their teaching curriculum, they are trying to bring in different faculties and experts to understand the views and get the students exposures. Certain things, students also have to do on their own. They need to do certain internships. They need to be more proactive. And everything cannot be in India. Also, we are very dependent on our colleges to be spoon feeding us. That is not. You also have to be very proactive to try out things, and you may well find out that you really don't like, public policy, or you don't like, policy based research, but everybody may not like it. But when you like it, you will have to also link it. I cannot just do a big modeling and come out and then discover and write down sunrises in the east. Like I cannot do a lot of modeling to come out and say that India needs foreign investment. That's obvious. No policymaker is going to buy it out. So when you are doing a research for a policymaker, you also have to identify what you need. So, when I do a policy research, and that is why I want to bring this, when I use a tool to do policy research, I can do a GTAP modeling, CG modeling, do every modeling, come back and say, okay, if you lower tariff, it will be beneficial. But if I go and give it to a policymaker, he will say, but what should be my negative list? So they have to sit for a negotiation. For them, my research is of no value. They will need me to do a negative list. They would rather want me to go back and say, A very precise answer. And that precise answer is probably, if you are going for a tariff reduction with the European Union in a very sensitive sector like alcoholic beverages, I understand from the industry that for the raw material that you import, you can bring down the tariff to 30 and then to 0, something to that effect. They want me to give a very, very precise solution rather than doing a model and coming and saying that if tariff is low, the GDP will grow, percentage of GDP will grow, because they have no clue. But that is very nice for my journal publication. But when I'm giving it to them, they want a very practical outcome of the problem. Of course, whether they will use it or not is entirely theirs, but my outcome has to be very practical.
Yeah. Thank you
Is
so
it
much.
clear to you, Mayank? And my outcome has to be, they can go totally against me, but my outcome has to be also, something which they have to come back to. If you read my report on FDI in retail, which I wrote in 2000, I wrote there that, brand-based policy will not work in India. The book sells still today because I used that word, but I at that time seriously believed it was not correct. So therefore, and my research shows, my survey showed that these kind of things, because people are brand, they are sub-brands. So, you have to give it. But definitely, once you give it, you say this is good, this may not work, and then you leave it to the policymakers to choose. Because policymakers, as I showed you in my third slide, use multiple things rather than economists to choose their final policy.
Okay, so thank you so much, ma'am, for motivating our students towards research. And Mayank, I'm looking forward to seeing your research paper soon. So, yes, Dr. Devanshu, I would request you to take it further from here.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. And on that note, I guess we come to the last leg of our session. Believe me, ma'am, it's one of those wonderful sessions. And to talk on topics like economy and relating it with public policy, I couldn't have identified that. Although, yes, we got the PPTs yesterday. I went it through. Then reading your research papers has given me a full insight that how those particular things are there. Not stopping on this particular thing, I'll rather say that this is the first step of the future endeavors as well, where we, at Jagrant Lake City University, specifically at the Jagrant School for Public Policy and International Affairs, would like to be there, both in the terms of research or if any other thing that we can join hands with you. Both in the personal capacity or in the capacity where the institutions can be there with think tank like ICRIER, and they are doing a wonderful job. So it would be our privilege if the students can be the part and they can work and learn under your able guidance. It would be a brilliant thing to work across. And on that note, I express my heartfelt thanks to Arpita ma'am for sparing out time. I understand that she is going through a very busy schedule as well. But thank you so much, ma'am. Those lovely insights on the role of economy in the public policy has definitely given a newer ambit to talk about. And as you were mentioning as well, that yes, at Jagrant Lake City University, we are focused more towards that bridging of gap, that it should not only be pure academic by nature. And people of your stature has brought that particular glance, has brought that particular area of thinking as well. On that note, I'd also like to thank Mr. Anu that he has supported us with that particular thing on all the backgrounds. So we were under constant touch, and then managing this entire session as well with his at the back end. So thank you so much, Anu sir, for this, for your lovely help as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, and on that note, thank you, students. And I hope this session was one of those particular insights on the economy portion. Last but not the least, special thanks to Raghuraj sir for moderating this session very wonderfully. It was indeed a pleasure. And thank you so much all for joining. Once again, thank you so much, Arpita ma'am, for being there, and looking forward for your kind guidance and support in future as well.
Yeah, definitely. It was my pleasure to be here and hearing all of you. And I kind of enjoyed my interaction with Mayank. And these bright students are, quite interesting. So we do have internship programs in ICRIER. You can apply online. See, we would not like everybody and anybody to apply, but of course we do like some of your good students. If you want to refer, please refer. We are taking internships. We do take internships, and it's a good learning experience when you are doing internships. Regarding work, if you have any work ideas, how you do, we will be always willing to work together. We hardly do a lot of projects at the state level, but if you come across any projects where we can do collaboratively, where we can work together, we will be very happy to collaborate.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And on that note, I guess the link was also provided to me by one of our deans here, Professor Divakar Shukla. So when he was there with the Ogilvy and the World Bank group, so he only told me that with ICRER, they worked for a talk show that was there, and they worked for a research thing. So which gave me an idea, and that also led me to connect you. And so on that note, again, ma'am, thank you so much. And we will certainly, what all things that we can collaborate, we'll be more than happy to have your assistance and support. So thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much for being.
Thank you, ma'am. We would like to have you on campus someday.
Surely, ma'am.
Hopefully, sometimes life will be more normal.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Once these situations get a bit better, so I guess Delhi and Bhopal are not too far enough. So it would be lovely to have an interaction with you personally as well. And physically, I guess that would also give a great support to the classroom teaching as well, which you lacked. So thank you so much, ma'am, once again. And I also thank the ICRIER, the entire group with you. So for this lovely session. And on that note, I bid a farewell to you as well, and a farewell to all my students. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great evening and rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, ma'am. Same to you.